All right, is everybody seeing my screen now? Can you hear me? Adriana, look good?
Good here.
All right, so today I'm going to be talking to you about science and Western monarch conservation. Oh, why is it not letting me do that? Like Adriana said, my name is Connie Masotti. That's a little bit about it. Love citizen science projects. And I will just warn you, we are going to be moving through some territory today. I will not be able to answer questions because 30 minutes is just not long enough to tell you all the amazing and wonderful things about monarchs. So what I have done is set up this email address that is dedicated specifically to any of you that want to email me for questions. I promise I will answer. I also have a whole slew of research stuff, the science that will back up some of the things that I will be talking about today. And so get a screenshot of this. It's also in the chat. I put it in the chat. And it also will be posted again when we get to some of the end slides. I'm going backwards. Let's do this. So my objectives today are I want to get you to be in awe of monarchs. I want you to get some knowledge and be knowledgeable about them and their habitats. I want you to be hopeful, and you'll see in a minute where there's been discouraging news and stuff, but we want to be moving forward and working in spite of this. I want to get you ready for the battle to change hearts and minds about the way that we've done our plantings and including natives, and to look at this as a way that we are playing it forward. So most of you may have heard about the Western monarch counts and the numbers being down. This is a graph from Xerces that does the Western monarch counts, and it shows from like 2016 to this last year of 2020, 2021. As Adriana said, I've been doing counts with Xerces for the last 10 years. I've been the regional coordinator with funding from the Pacific Grove Museum of Natural History Museum to do all of these because a lot of the sites are down in Big Sur and require some traveling. And what we do is go to these sites, we count the monarchs because they're still, if you get them early in the morning, and it's a good time to count. If you look at 2016, the furthest on the left over here, you see the numbers for the state. These are Thanksgiving counts. They're done the 3 weeks around Thanksgiving when the numbers should be the highest because the monarchs have just come to the overwintering sites. I counted 80,000 monarchs. Myself and other members of Volunteers for the Museum counted over 80,000 monarchs at the sites in Monterey County that were about 15 or 16 that year that we went to. And you can see that was in the 10 years I've been doing monarch work here in California. That was the banner year that we've had. Monarchs have been in trouble decades, but we had a really great year that year compared to years past. But you can see it's been a downward trend since then. And insects, like a lot of creatures, can have fluctuations. And so 1 year drop and a great harvest of them the next year, not harvest because we won't harvest them, but a great number of them the next year is not a whole lot to worry about because those are natural trends based on whether there's food supplies, what the weather's doing, and a whole plethora of other things. But when you start seeing these continual downward trends over the years, that's when you worry about. And in 2018, when they dropped below 30,000, they stayed below that again in 2019. And this is monarchs that migrated from all of the Western states. There's about 11 of them. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then this past year, it dropped. There were only about 1,642 monarchs in overwintering sites that were these migrating monarchs. And 5 years ago, also Xerces started a New Year's count that's done the first 2 weeks typically of January, because you do have a lot of mortality during the Thanksgiving count and January because we get storms, we get some that just didn't store enough fats as they migrated. So they may die, there may be predation. So the January counts give you a more realistic idea of the amount of monarchs that you will see that are there that are going to be going out and starting that all important first generation. This year for me in Monterey County, I only had 30 of them. And so that was really disheartening to go from that huge number that we had to this. So what's causing all this? I've heard it say that it's death by 1,000 cuts. All these things that are popping up, pesticides, frequent storms, overwintering site degradation, all of those things are some of the things that the monarchs are up against. And so just planting milkweeds, I almost hate that slogan to some degree, because it's so many more things that we have to fix. And if only it were that easy to plant milkweeds, the problem would be much easier. We've got to overcome some major things. And so we're going to be talking in here. I took a lot of this from Xerces and their call to action. I work closely with Xerces, and I'm a partner with Monarch Joint Venture to see what we can do. I will be talking mostly about if you live along the coast like we do here in Monterey County, what you can do, but it also covers the western states. I've kind of ranked them out. I've used the science as I see it. I encourage you, email me to get these science things. Don't believe it just because I say it. Don't believe it just because you went on a Facebook group and saw it. Go to the science and research it yourself, and then see if you see what I see and see how you maybe can see some time to learn. One thing that I included in my 6 things I did was that spending time learning everything about monarchs and from these scientific groups like I just talked about. And that you can do, if you don't want to email me, you can go to Xerces Monarch Joint Venture. I highly recommend their sites, but I can narrow some of that down to you. And if you email me because you're not finding an answer to a question, even if I don't know it, I can probably steer you towards people that do. So if you've been confused by hearing me say Western monarch, well, that's some of the information you need to know. This arrow is pointing to the Rocky Mountains. That is kind of what we consider the dividing line between the Western population, which is west of the Rockies, and the Eastern population, which is east of the Rockies. Simple enough, right? This graph actually shows the orange arrows are after summer breeding, temperatures are changing, so those monarchs have to leave where they are. They start their migration, they're storing fats, they've gone into a diapause where they're not sexually mature, and they are flying to try and stay ahead of colder temperatures, which would kill them. They are a insect, so they're cold-blooded and do not do well with freezing temperatures. And so that the orange ones show you the migration down to Mexico for the eastern, and then along the coast from our states in the west. The green arrows show you what I call remigration or spring migration. They will all mate, both Mexico and our California overwintering monarchs will mate in the overwintering sites, although they can mate along the route, they can mate multiple times. And so they will head back up to repopulate and start those 1 to 5 generations of them, 3 to 5 generations you should see in the summer. Number 2, we've got to protect monarchs and their habitat from pesticides. This is my number 2 because as I started discovering really how to do monarch conservation and advocate for that, I realized I had to learn about pesticides, because if you think about it here for us in California, our monarchs are either born in it, they have to pass through it when they migrate to overwintering sites most of the time, especially if they're coming from states outside of California. And then they have to pass back through it to be born in it, possibly again, and go on. And that's just in the agriculture areas. We as individuals and municipalities are actually the worst abusers of pesticides, insecticides, herbicides, fungicides. All of those can and will damage your monarchs in some stage of their life and other pollinators. Some of these effects are lethal, or they're sublethal. That was a term I learned that I did not know. Lethal outright kills them. That's usually what we think of. So if you know there's chemicals and you're seeing, pollinators go to your plants and then they fly away, you think, oh, well, they're okay now. There are sublethal ones that could be damaging their sex organs so they can't mate. It could be affecting migration. could be affecting how they find nectar. So there's lots of things that you just never even think about until you start looking at these pesticides. And even organic pesticides are harmful. They still have chemical. Neem's oil, even if you're using dishwater, soap, and water to spray to get your aphids off your milkweeds, because everybody seems to really hate that. And they do look unsightly, but nature will balance that out, I promise you. Be aware that if you put it on there to kill one insect, that chemical is not going to know one insect from the other. And so that's a clue. If you're putting it on there to kill one insect, it's going to kill others. And so you don't want to be killing or harming the very thing you're trying to protect. We got to protect and manage our overwintering sites. That is so important, and that's where most of my time has been spent. And so I'm going to teach you a little bit about overwintering sites, because if you don't know what an overwintering site is or what makes up an overwintering site, you need to learn, especially if you live near one. This is a great booklet that Xerces has put out that, I'm sorry, some of this stuff is covering my stuff, but it's Protecting California's Butterfly Groves. And, you know, it's a clue, I say, that not just any eucalyptus will do. So just because you see a stand of eucalyptuses, there are a lot of different qualities that microclimate has to have for the monarchs to be able to use it. One, evergreen trees for wind protection. A lot of times they're in an L or a U shape, or even down in like a gully or something to give them added wind protection. So eucalyptuses definitely can fit that bill, and monarchs have adapted to them, but that does not mean that that's their preferred tree. We're lucky enough in Monterey County that, just like you see in this picture, and by the way, all these pictures are mine, just so you'll know, this is on a cypress. We see them on Monterey pines. I've seen them on redwoods, and I've even seen a few on oaks. So native trees are even better, because that benefits all our other creatures that live in these same areas with these monarchs. I like to say monarchs like a refrigerator, not freezing temps. The only icicles they like are these beautiful little drips and drops of the lace lichen that are in this wonderful Monterey cypress here. Again, monarchs are cold-blooded, so our refrigerator temps are actually what they want for an overwintering site, because it's winter time and there's not very much blooming. So they want to really save as much of that stored fat that they've gotten as they migrated and did their nectaring, because they have to live all through the winter months, make it through then, and then use a lot of that energy still, because the mating is a wonderful, miraculous thing. If you've never seen that, being in an overwintering site, we used to get to see lots of that when we had lots of monarchs, and it was just amazing to see. But they also, females will then have to travel to try and find enough milkweed so that she can lay these 300 to 600 or more eggs she will sometimes have. Optimum is not for her to do what's called egg dumping. Hopefully she will find enough milkweed that she can spread her DNA by placing an egg on a different stem of milkweed. And that way, just think the wonders of that, you know, preserving her DNA and being able to see it go forward, because it's unlikely that 300 plants would all get wiped out. But if she laid all her eggs on one, well, it might. Monarchs need the fogs that are along the coast. All your overwintering sites pretty much are along the coast or in the Bay Area along the rivers up there. But they don't like a lot of heavy rains, just because sometimes that brings freezing temperatures. And when they freeze, and especially if they're wet and they crystallize, that can be a death sentence for them. But they need moisture. So our fogs are very important to them along the coast. Unfortunately, those have been decreasing as well. They love to have not too much shade, because then that gets really cold, and then they will not be able to move at all once they are in the clusters and the weather gets cold and below that 55 degrees. But they don't want it too bright, because they don't want the temperatures to be too hot, which will stimulate them to be flying, using up all of the fat stores that they have. So they're looking for these little wonderful dappled sunlight areas that usually happen in the mornings, maybe late afternoons, and that could be just right for them. They need understory structure. So if you're near an overwintering site, or talking to people that manage it or trying to get proper management, number one, you need the downed leaves and limbs, even if they are eucalyptus leaves. I know they have a toxin in it that makes it where not a lot of other things grow, but you got to make do with what you got to make do, because all of that detritus needs to be decomposing to have healthy soils, to draw the other creatures into it, because all of that is what makes up that microclimate. So if you're constantly pulling all of that out, if you're raking leaves out from underneath there because you're trying to make it look pretty, well, you got to look at what's pretty from a monarch site. That's part of that learning to fight the battle, and knowing that we've got to change our perception on some of these things. Say pretty for your actual park, but this is a natural area. Make it so the monarchs think it's a great place, and all the other creatures. And a great bonus to them is if there are native nectar sources nearby. Why do I say native? Monarchs are generalists in the way that they nectar, because they come from a lot of different states that have different native flowers. So what might be native for them here in California and non-native would be the opposite in another state. So we're planting native nectar sources for all of these other creatures. A lot of them pollinators, bees and stuff, actually pollinate much better than even our butterflies do. I know that's heresy to say that, but it's the truth. We're planting for them. And for us in overwintering sites, monarchs are typically only there from like late October till maybe, if you're really lucky these days, end of February. These other creatures, our little anise hummingbirds that are in most of these places, are there year round. So planting native nectar sources are a great thing for all the other creatures that need nectar that are in these overwintering sites. You got to know where these overwintering sites are. I just did a screenshot. You can actually go to the Western Monarch site that Xerces has and get much closer look up and see exactly where they are. Because if you live close to them, what you do and what you plant is different than if you live in places more than 5 miles away from the coast. That's a rule of thumb that Xerces has kind of come up with, that if you are north of Santa Barbara, you should not plant milkweeds within 5 miles of the coast, because they've done studies historically. It did not grow there on its own. Will it grow if you plant it? Yes, but is that what you should be doing? Probably not. And definitely, because it's probably going to be, natives are going to be dormant when monarchs are there anyway, because they only come along the coast a lot of times during the overwintering season. To me, you've wasted a little bit of your monarch conservancy, conservation cash that you've got going, because if you're like me, you only have so much that you can put for this. And so then you can take and put it towards other sources that I'll be talking about. Not all of these sites are active. We go to what are called historical sites that haven't had monarchs. The sites have degraded, but just to make sure something hasn't changes and that we're not missing monarchs, we do go back to a lot of those. This year, when we got the 30 monarchs, I actually upped it, and because of COVID, it was me for most of it. I did help in PG. We do weekly counts there because we gather a lot of extra data. That's a citizen science project, so that's a good thing to do. But just to rest people's mind easy that we are looking everywhere we know of, but understanding that monarchs just don't pop up and overwinter everywhere because they need a lot of these conditions is very important. And know if you live near one is very important. We've got to restore breeding and migratory habitat in California, because you could have lots of monarchs in the breeding areas that are outside of California, but if they can't have the resources they need as they're migrating, monarchs look for favorable winds, they look for abundance of nectar sources, they look for water resources. We wouldn't want them to have a lot of chemicals if we can reduce those. So we've got to do a lot of that within California itself to be able to give them a good start, because it kind of begins and ends here. California is the Mexico to the Eastern population. And so we really have to do things to help. A lot of that is just plant native milkweeds and nectar plants, unless you're in that 5-mile zone. The more varieties, the better. You don't want a monoculture of things. This is a map that has that kind of shows you, if you live in California, some priority zones. That avocado green is that 5-mile zone that I was talking about. The aqua color is that all-important zone that they think is where the monarchs should be able to find milkweed just emerging in that early spring, late winter, as they're leaving the overwintering sites to lay their eggs. And then the more turquoise color is, everything else. And so if you're not sure what you should plant because you're not sure if you're 5 miles from the coast or in this area, native nectar sources is never going to be inappropriate or wrong. A great book to talk to you more about why native plants are a good thing to do is Bringing Home Nature by Doug Ptolemy. There's tons of videos from your California Native Plant Society they've done with him. He has videos. Everybody thinks that I'm what they call a purist. I'm really not. I don't tell people your yard is full of non-natives, pull every one of them up and plant natives. That's unrealistic. People can't do that. Plus, monarchs can use them. It's better to have stuff that may not be the best stuff versus not having anything for them. So my recommendation is, as you plant new plants, make them native plants. And as you replace plants, do it with native plants. Being aware that for monarchs and a lot of the butterflies to use them, they need to be in sun most of the time. Monarchs don't like to go in the shade to be able to get their nectar sources, especially if you're trying to do that and you're near an overwintering site. 70 to 90% of natives is a good goal to go for. So therefore, you can still have your favorite plant that your grandmother had in her yard when you were a child, and you can still have those. There's nothing wrong with that. And it's not that non-native plants or exotics, as you may hear them, are not beautiful. They are. But there's reasons why natives are needed. Again, much more in that book and in the information I can send you. Be aware of what plants are invasive where you live. You do not want to be putting Genesta in your yard, which is a big invasive here. But there are sites you can go to that will tell you what is invasive in your area. And California is so big, be aware that some things that if you don't look, like if you live along the coast, there are some things along the coast that tend to be more invasive that aren't a problem in some of the other areas. Invasive just means that they naturalize very easily, the seeds go everywhere, and they take up space for our natives and displace them a lot of times. And another guide that I like to see when I'm talking about this, and people will go, oh, well, my favorite that happens to be an invasive, they love it. The birds love it. The monarchs love it. The nectar, they come to it. But that's not a good guide. If our creatures knew what was the best for them, then you'd never have to rush your dog to the hospital because it ate chocolate, because it would know that chocolate has a chance of killing them. They don't know that. That's up to us to try and put nature back in balance, undo a lot of this that we've done, and do the best for them that we can. It's a little bit like junk food if you plant if everything's non-natives, because it may not have the right nutrients they need at the right time, and it definitely hasn't co-evolved with all the other creatures that you hope are coming to your yard and visiting you, eating your plants and getting your nectar. You'll hear a lot about residential monarchs. That's where non-native milkweeds have been planted along the coast, especially in warmer areas that do not die back. So when monarchs come to these overwintering sites, there's lots of discussion about whether or not it causes them to not be in diapause anymore and to come out and then start being breeders. Once they would lay their eggs, then they're done and they would not be migrators. I think the biggest question is their eggs, when they hatch out, do they become migrators or are they now residents? And so by continuing to plant this, and I put X's on these, this is a patch that I watch. One of the sites I monitor that has them, she does bring them inside and hand rear them, which is something else that we should not do in great numbers. But it has really thrown off a lot of my research that I'm trying to do for some of these groups in Pacific Grove, especially since I have no monarchs in the overwintering site. But these are just a couple of blocks away from the main Pacific Grove site. And actually, there have been monarchs in years past that clustered within 30 feet of these. So it's been quite the scientific endeavor to see what's happening with these. I would suggest that if you are, doing these practices, definitely listen to when I talk about being part of a citizen science group so that we can get the information and make a definitive, statement about whether this is good or not, because we're studying, it's happening. We think it's changing the way monarchs are doing it. And so we want to get some definitive stuff on it. So there's places to do that research. Another thing you can do if you're in the migratory pathways or even in an overwintering site is monarchs do need water. A lot of your overwintering sites will have a water source. This is a little puddling thing I did in a plant saucer. You keep the mud wet. The monarchs and sometimes bees or other things can light on it. The males, and especially a lot of other butterflies, like to get the minerals out of the mud. That's why it's called puddling. It helps them be more virile and have minerals that they need to be more successful at mating, and we definitely want that. You can also do a water source with just the marbles or rocks without the sand, especially if you're in those migratory pathways. You can be in San Francisco in the 10th story and set out a little saucer like this, and you might be surprised that you see a monarch stopping by or a bee or something stopping by to get a sip of water.
Just a reminder, we have about 3 minutes.
Okay. So we've got to protect their breeding habitat in places outside of California. Again, that's very much like a lot of the things we've talked about. If you're not near the overwintering sites, let biodiversity rule. You want lots of plants. Another thing you can do to help them is advocate for monarchs legislatively. Go to your city council meetings, to your HOAs. Do it on a global scale, a US scale, a local scale. But there's lots of legislation that needs to happen to protect these guys too, especially right now since they're not on any endangered species list yet. That could be coming. That's being looked at every year. And then join a citizen science project. Sometimes it's called community science. Pictures have been a great way for me to be able to see things. This is a squirrel I captured. It's on a webinar that U.S. Fish and Wildlife puts out with Xerces and with Monarch Joint Venture, and they use it to talk about a parasitoid. Go to your nurseries. This has a great sign. This is California native plants, but the ones that have the X's on them, all that yellow, those are actually non-native plants. Sorry, that's my little thing going off telling me it's about time. And I just pointed this out to them. They changed that. There's a monarch and milkweed mapper that you can join. Their Western Monarch counts as a citizen group. That's us doing some of those. So this again is the Monarchs and the Science at gmail.com. Monarch Joint Venture, they have a Monarch larva monitoring project that you can take a class even to learn if you have milkweeds and monarchs larvae in your area. And hopefully I've used these objectives to be able to teach you a little bit so that you can pay it forward. Because a lot of this stuff we're doing is not something we'll see an immediate response to. If I planted a native tree in a overwintering site, hoping it to do monarchs good, that's going to be decades. And so be knowing that you're paying this forward and you may not actually see that. And so I will end it there. There's that email address that you can email me for questions. I promise I will answer you. You can get more resources, and hopefully we've taught you a little in this 30 minutes.